Behind the rusted dumpsters of Boston's most guarded estate, Clara clutched a crumpled ultrasound, terrified, pregnant, and utterly alone. Her broken sobs vanished into the freezing rain. Hidden within the shadows, however, the city's most ruthless crime lord stood silently, listening to every agonizing sound. The wind howling off Lake Michigan was merciless that November evening, biting through thin cotton of Clara's Maid uniform. At 22, Clara Jenkins had learned to become invisible. It was a survival tactic she had perfected ever since she took a job at the Russo estate on Astor Street in Boston's Gold Coast. She was hired to dust the imported marble, polish the crystal chandeliers, and keep her eyes glued to the floor. The estate belonged to Maximilian Russo, the don of the Boston Syndicate. To the public, he was a real estate mogul with a penchant for philanthropy. To the underworld, he was the judge, jury, and executioner of the Midwest. Clara didn't care about his mafia ties. She only cared that the Russo family paid their staff triple the standard rate. She needed the money to keep her father on life support at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. But now, a new, far more desperate complication had taken root in her life. Clara was 20 weeks pregnant. Hiding a growing bump under an oversized apron was becoming impossible. The relentless morning sickness and dizzy spells were drawing the suspicious eyes of Mrs. Gable, the estate's draconian head housekeeper. Clara knew that the moment they discovered her condition, she would be fired, tossed out into the unforgiving Boston winter without a dime or a reference. That evening, the nausea hit her like a freight train during the post-dinner cleanup. Mumbling an excuse about taking out the kitchen refuse, Clara burst out the heavy steel back doors into the freezing alleyway behind the estate's massive kitchen. She dumped the bags and collapsed against the brick wall, sliding down until she hit the wet pavement, hidden from the security cameras by a row of industrial dumpsters. The tears came then, hot, fast, and entirely uninvited. "I can't do this," Clara whispered into the freezing air, her hands trembling as she pulled a crumpled ultrasound photo from her apron pocket. She rubbed her slightly rounded stomach, letting out a shattered sob. "I'm so sorry, little one. Your father is a ghost. He doesn't even know you exist. And if I lose this job, if the Moretti crew finds out my father owes them money, we have nowhere left to go." She reached beneath her collar, her freezing fingers wrapping around a heavy silver signet ring that hung from a cheap chain resting against her collarbone. It was her only connection to the child's father. 6 months ago, before she moved to Boston, Clara had been working a grueling catering gig at the St. Regis in New York. The hotel had been locked down due to a sudden citywide blackout. In the chaos, a man had dragged her into a pitch-black service closet to hide from heavily armed men sweeping the hallways. He was bleeding from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Clara had ripped her apron to bandage him in the dark. Adrenaline, fear, and a strange, desperate magnetism had taken over. In the suffocating darkness of that closet, clinging to each other for survival, a reckless intimacy ignited. She never saw his face. He never learned her name. Before the emergency lights flickered on, he had kissed her forehead, slipped a heavy silver ring into her palm, and vanished into the stairwell. "I'm so tired," Clara wept into her knees behind the dumpsters, the silver ring clinking against the brick. "I just want to be safe." What Clara didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Just on the other side of the brick partition, standing on the covered wrought-iron smoking balcony, was Maximilian Russo. He had just concluded a volatile, 3-hour sit-down with his underboss regarding a territorial dispute at O'Hare International. The tension was thick enough to cut with a switchblade. Seeking a moment of silence, Maximilian had stepped out into the freezing night to smoke a cohiba. Then he heard the weeping. Maximilian was not a man easily moved by tears. In his world, tears were usually a prelude to a lie or a plea for a life he was about to extinguish. But there was something profoundly shattered in the voice echoing from the alley. He stepped quietly down the short metal staircase, moving with the silent grace of a predator, until he stood just inches away from the corner of the dumpster. He listened as the girl spoke to her unborn child. He heard the sheer desperation in her voice, and he heard the faint metallic clink of silver hitting brick. Maximilian peered around the rusted metal. He recognized her as one of the new maids, small, quiet, always looking at her shoes. But it wasn't the girl that made the breath catch in the Don's throat. It was the moonlight catching the silver object dangling from her neck, a custom-forged, platinum signet ring bearing the crest of the Russo family. His ring. The one he had given to a faceless angel in the dark at the St. Regis. The girl who had saved him from a Moretti hit squad and vanished before he could find her. Maximilian stood frozen, a rare occurrence for a man whose mind processed threats at lightning speed. The pieces slammed together with dizzying clarity. The blackout, the scent of vanilla and fear in that cramped closet, the soft hands that had bound his bleeding shoulder. And now, she was here, in his territory, in his house, crying in the snow, carrying his air. A sudden, violent wave of possessiveness tore through him. Maximilian dropped his cigar, crushing it beneath his leather dress shoe. The sound was sharp in the quiet alley. Clara gasped, scrambling backward on the wet pavement like a cornered rabbit. She shoved the ultrasound into her pocket and tucked the ring back under her shirt, her eyes wide with absolute terror as the towering figure of her employer stepped out of the shadows. Maximilian was an intimidating man. Standing 6'3", dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, his dark eyes held a cold, calculating intensity that made grown men tremble. "Mr. Russo," Clara stammered, her teeth chattering from the cold and the fear. The trash was heavy. I just needed a minute." "Stand up," Maximilian commanded. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of its usual icy edge, but still ringing with absolute authority. Clara tried to push herself up, but her limbs were numb from the freezing rain. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Before she could hit the ground, Maximilian closed the distance between them. He caught her by the waist, his large, warm hands stabilizing her. The scent of expensive cologne and tobacco wrapped around her, triggering an aggressive wave of déjà vu that Clara couldn't quite place. "You're freezing," he muttered, stripping off his heavy wool suit jacket and wrapping it around her trembling shoulders. "Please don't fire me," Clara pleaded, tears spilling over her frozen cheeks. "I know I shouldn't be out here resting. I'm sorry. I'll work double shifts. I just need this job, please." Maximilian looked down at her pale, terrified face. His eyes dropped to the slight swell of her stomach beneath the apron. His jaw clenched so tight, a muscle ticked in his cheek. His child, growing inside this terrified woman who thought he was going to throw her onto the street. "You're not fired," Maximilian said quietly. He kept his arm securely around her waist. "But you're done working. Come inside." I didn't give her a choice. He guided her through the heavy steel doors, past the massive industrial kitchen, where the rest of the staff stopped dead in their tracks. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, dropped a silver serving tray with a deafening clatter when she saw the Don of the Boston Syndicate ushering a lowly maid through the hall, his own jacket draped over her. "Mr. Russo," Mrs. Gable sputtered. "What is the meaning of—" "Pack Miss Jenkins's belongings," Maximilian ordered, not even pausing his stride as he led Clara toward the private elevator. "Move them to the master suite in the East Wing. She is no longer on the payroll. If I see a dust cloth in her hand again, I will hold you personally responsible, Gable." Clara's head spun as the elevator doors closed, sealing them inside the mahogany-paneled box. I don't understand," she whispered, her hands clutching the lapels of his oversized jacket. "The East Wing? That's your private floor. Why are you doing this?" Maximilian hit the button for the top floor. He turned to face her, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers grazing her collarbone as he pulled the silver chain from beneath her shirt. The signet ring rested heavily against his knuckles. "You told me you were afraid of the dark," Maximilian said softly. Clara stopped breathing. The phrase echoed in her mind, a ghost from 6 months ago. "I'm afraid of the dark," she had whispered in the St. Regis closet. "I'm right here," the bleeding stranger had replied. Her eyes widened, flying up to meet Maximilian's. "You," she breathed out, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "It was you." "It was me," Maximilian confirmed, his thumb brushing away a stray tear on her cheek. "And if I had known who you were, Clara, you wouldn't have spent a single second scrubbing floors in my house. You are carrying a Russo, which means from this second forward, nobody touches you. Nobody breathes near you without my permission. You are under my protection." But protection in the Mafia world was a double-edged sword. As the elevator carried them to the top floor, neither of them noticed the calculating gaze of Lorenzo Costa, Maximilian's consigliere, standing at the end of the first-floor corridor. Lorenzo had been secretly funneling inside information to the rival Moretti family for months, waiting for the perfect weakness to exploit in Maximilian's armor. Lorenzo pulled out an encrypted burner phone, his eyes narrowing as the elevator dial ticked upward to Maximilian's private sanctuary. He typed a quick message to the head of the Moretti syndicate. "The Don has a blind spot, a maid, and she's carrying his heir. We have our leverage." The east wing of the Russo estate was a gilded cage of silk, mahogany, and bulletproof glass. For Clara, the transition from an invisible servant, scrubbing baseboards, to the most protected woman in Boston was a terrifying whiplash. Her new reality was confined to 3,000 square feet of absolute luxury, guarded by armed men, stationed at every elevator and stairwell. Maximilian wasted no time solidifying his claim. Within 24 hours, he had flown in Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the chief of obstetrics at Rush University Medical Center, to set up a state-of-the-art medical suite right inside the penthouse. Clara lay on the plush velvet sofa, staring at the ceiling frescoes as Dr. Pendleton ran the ultrasound wand over her stomach. Maximilian stood in the corner of the room, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. He hadn't spoken a word since the machine booted up, but his dark eyes were locked onto the monitor with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the silent room. Clara let out a shaky breath, a tear slipping down her cheek. Suddenly, Maximilian stepped forward. He bypassed the doctor entirely, sinking to one knee beside the sofa. He reached out, his massive, scarred hand gently engulfing Clara's smaller, trembling one. "Strong heartbeat, Mr. Russo," Dr. Pendleton said, packing up his equipment with practiced discretion. 20 weeks, healthy development. She needs rest, high-quality nutrition, and absolutely no stress. Understood. "Leave us," Maximilian commanded softly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Once the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the doctor, the silence stretched between them. Maximilian lifted Clara's hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart, awakening the visceral memory of his touch in the dark closet of the St. Regis. "I looked for you," Maximilian confessed, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "After the blackout, I tore Manhattan apart, looking for the girl with the silver ring. I had my men hack the hotel's employment records, but you were off the books." "I was a temp for the catering company," Clara whispered, pulling her hospital gown tightly around herself. "I left for Boston the next morning. My father had a massive stroke. The medical bills. He owed money to a loan shark connected to the Moretti family. If I didn't pay, they were going to pull his life support and take it out on me." Maximilian's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking dangerously. The mention of the rival Moretti syndicate, the very family who had sent the hit squad to New York 6 months ago, ignited a terrifying fire in his eyes. "Your father was transferred this morning to the VIP recovery wing at Northwestern Memorial," Maximilian stated, his tone brooking no argument. "The floor is secured by my men. His debts to the Morettis have been erased. They will never breathe your name, or his, ever again." Clara gasped, covering her mouth as a fresh wave of tears hit her. "Maximilian, you didn't have to—" "You are carrying my child, Clara," he interrupted, his hand moving to gently rest over her rounded stomach. The protective reverence in his touch was staggering. "You saved my life in the dark. Now it is my turn to pull you into the light. You are a Russo now. My family. My blood." But even as Maximilian made his vows in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, the poison was already seeping through the floorboards of his empire. Down in the estate's heavily monitored communication hub, Lorenzo Costa, Maximilian's trusted consigliere, was setting the final pieces of his treasonous puzzle into place. Lorenzo had spent 20 years in the shadow of the Russo family, simmering in resentment. The Morettis had promised him half of Boston's territory and the Don's seat if he could deliver Maximilian's head. And now, Maximilian had a glaring, pregnant weakness. 2 days later, a violent storm battered Boston, turning the streets into slick, black rivers. Maximilian was in his private study with Clara, feeding her strawberries from a silver platter when the heavy oak doors burst open. "Boss," Lorenzo said, breathless, his perfectly tailored suit damp with rain. "We have a massive situation. The Morettis just ambushed our weapons shipment at the port of Boston. They've pinned down our best crew. If we lose that shipment, we lose the port." Maximilian's romantic demeanor vanished in a microsecond, replaced by the chilling, calculating aura of the Midwest's deadliest crime lord. He stood up, retrieving his shoulder holster from the back of his chair. "Lock down the estate," Maximilian barked, checking the magazine of his customized Glock. He turned to Clara, his expression softening just a fraction. "Do not leave this floor. I will be back before midnight." He kissed her forehead, a fleeting brand of ownership, and swept out of the room. Lorenzo lingered in the doorway for a fraction of a second, his dead eyes meeting Clara's. A cold shiver violently racked her spine. There was something empty in the consigliere's gaze, a hollow void that triggered every survival instinct Clara had honed on the streets. As soon as the elevators chimed, signaling Maximilian's departure, Lorenzo walked over to the security panel on the wall. With 3 swift keystrokes, he bypassed the biometric locks. The security cameras blinked off. The magnetic seals on the penthouse doors deactivated with a soft hiss. "What are you doing?" Clara demanded, pushing herself up from the velvet sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Just securing the perimeter, Miss Jenkins," Lorenzo lied smoothly, pulling a suppressed pistol from his jacket. "We wouldn't want any uninvited guests." Before Clara could scream, the heavy doors to the private balcony shattered inward. 4 men dressed in tactical black gear, wearing the crest of the Moretti family, poured into the room. Clara scrambled backward, throwing a heavy crystal vase at the first man. But they were too fast. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth, the acrid smell of chloroform burning her nostrils. "Take the service elevator," Lorenzo ordered the hitmen, stepping over the shattered glass. "The Don is busy chasing ghosts at the port. By the time he realizes the trap, his heir will belong to the Morettis." The darkness rushed up to swallow Clara, dragging her under as the terrified screams of her unborn child echoed silently in her mind. The port of Boston was a sprawling maze of rusted shipping containers and crashing waves. Maximilian's fleet of black SUVs tore through the loading docks, heavily armed men spilling out into the freezing rain. Maximilian kicked open the door to Warehouse 4, his gun raised, ready to unleash hell. But the warehouse was empty. No shipment. No pinned-down crew. No Morettis. Just the howling wind and the smell of ozone. Maximilian froze, the tactical gears in his mind grinding to a violent halt. He pulled out his encrypted phone and checked the live security feed of the East Wing penthouse. Connection lost. A roar of absolute, unadulterated fury ripped from Maximilian's throat. It was a sound that made his most hardened enforcers step back in terror. "It's a decoy," he bellowed over the storm. "Lorenzo! That rat bastard gave them the codes. Everyone, back in the cars. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn this entire city to the ground." Meanwhile, miles away in the desolate industrial wasteland of back of the yards, Clara jolted awake. Her head throbbed violently, her vision swimming as the harsh glare of a single, swinging industrial light bulb assaulted her eyes. The air smelled of rust, old blood, and damp concrete. She was sitting in a heavy wooden chair, her wrists bound tightly behind her back with thick plastic zip ties. "Ah, the Sleeping Beauty awakens," a cruel, mocking voice echoed from the shadows. Matteo Moretti, the sociopathic heir to the Moretti syndicate, stepped into the light. He twirled a gleaming hunting knife between his fingers, his eyes dropping to Clara's swollen stomach with a sickening grin. Lorenzo stood behind him, his face impassive. "Maximilian will kill you," Clara rasped, her throat dry. She fought to keep the terror out of her voice, channeling the fierce protective instinct of a mother cornered by wolves. "Maximilian is currently tearing up the port, chasing shadows," Matteo laughed, pacing around her chair like a vulture. "By the time he figures out you're at the old meat-packing plant, we'll have sent him a very special care package. I'm thinking, the silver ring around your neck, attached to a ransom note demanding the entire South Side territory." Matteo reached out, grabbing the silver chain around Clara's neck and yanking it so hard the metal bit into her skin. The platinum signet ring fell from her shirt, dangling between them. "Such a heavy piece of metal for a little maid," Matteo sneered, turning his back to her to inspect the Russo crest on the ring under the light bulb. It was the mistake that would cost him everything. Clara wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a survivor. As Matteo turned his back, Clara twisted her wrists behind the chair. The zip ties were agonizingly tight, cutting off her circulation, but she felt something sharp protruding from the splintered wood of the old chair back, a rusted, exposed nail. Gritting her teeth against the blinding pain, Clara scraped the plastic zip tie against the rusty iron nail. Back and forth, back and forth. Blood slicked her wrists, acting as a grim lubricant. The plastic began to fray. "Lorenzo, get the camera," Matteo ordered. "I want a video of her begging. It will break Maximilian's mind before we even take the territory." Lorenzo pulled out a camera, stepping forward. "Smile, Miss Jenkins." Snap. The zip tie around Clara's wrists gave way. In one fluid, desperate motion driven by pure adrenaline, Clara lunged forward. She didn't run. She tackled Matteo from behind, her hands wrapping around the heavy silver chain he was still holding. She twisted the chain violently, pulling the heavy platinum signet ring directly into Matteo's eye. Matteo shrieked, dropping the hunting knife as he clawed at his bleeding face. Clara scrambled across the dirty concrete floor, scooping up the dropped knife. She backed into the corner, holding the blade in front of her trembling, pregnant belly, her eyes wild and feral. "You bitch!" Matteo roared, pulling a gun from his waistband, blood streaming down his face. "I'll carve that bastard child out of you myself." Before Matteo could level the barrel, the entire front wall of the warehouse exploded inward. A reinforced, armor-plated SUV smashed through the rusted corrugated metal doors, sending debris flying like shrapnel. The vehicle hadn't even come to a complete stop before the doors flew open. Maximilian Russo stepped out into the dust and chaos, stepping over the rubble like a god of war. His suit jacket was gone, his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. In his hands, he held an automatic assault rifle. His eyes locked onto Clara, huddled in the corner with the knife, bleeding but alive. Then his gaze shifted to Matteo, who was aiming a gun at her. The air in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. There was no negotiation, no mafia sit-down, no grand speech. Maximilian raised the rifle and fired. A precise, controlled burst of 3 rounds struck Matteo dead center in the chest. The Moretti hair was dead before he hit the concrete floor, his gun skittering uselessly away. Lorenzo screamed, dropping the camera and scrambling toward the back exit, pulling his own weapon. But Maximilian was faster. He dropped the rifle, drawing his customized Glock, and shot Lorenzo in both kneecaps. The traitor collapsed, howling in agony as the rest of Maximilian's heavily armed crew swarmed the warehouse, securing the perimeter and aiming laser sights at Lorenzo's head. Maximilian ignored the screaming traitor. He dropped his weapon and ran across the warehouse floor, dropping to his knees and sliding the last few feet until he reached Clara. "Clara, Clara, look at me," Maximilian pleaded, his voice breaking with a raw, desperate emotion the underworld had never seen from him. He pried the knife from her frozen, bloody fingers and pulled her fiercely against his chest. "I've got you," he breathed into her hair, rocking her as she finally dropped the knife and buried her face in his neck, sobbing uncontrollably. "I've got you. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. I swear it on my life." He tried to take the ring," Clara choked out, her hands gripping his shirt desperately. Maximilian looked down at the bloody wrists of the woman he loved, seeing the fierce, terrifying lengths she had gone to in order to protect their child. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his dark eyes burning with absolute adoration and a lethal promise of security. "He took nothing," Maximilian whispered fiercely. "You are a Russo, Clara. You are the queen of this city now, and anyone who looks at you wrong will meet the same fate." He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her out of the blood-stained warehouse and into the waiting armored convoy. Behind them, the agonizing screams of Lorenzo Costa echoed in the night, a brutal symphony of mafia justice playing out as the Don carried his family home. Months later, the Boston underworld learned a very simple, terrifying lesson. The Russo syndicate was untouchable, not because of their guns or their money, but because of the woman who sat beside the Don. Clara Russo, the maid who survived the dark, had birthed the heir to the empire, and God help anyone who dared to stand in her shadow. Wow, what an incredible journey of survival, betrayal, and absolute mafia devotion. Clara went from an invisible, terrified maid to the untouchable queen of the Boston Syndicate. Do you think Lorenzo got what he deserved? How far would you go to protect your family? If you loved this intense mafia romance story, hit that like button, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, high-stakes romantic tales every week.